In the quiet town of Briarwood, nestled between dense forests and fog-covered hills, Halloween had always been a cherished tradition. This year, however, things felt different. The streets were quieter, the decorations more subdued. People whispered of strange things happening in the woods and seeing movements, eerie howls echoing in the dead of night. But the townsfolk brushed it off as overactive imaginations or tricks of the wind. That was until the night of the town's annual Halloween festival. Children in costumes filled the town square. Adults gathered around bonfires, and laughter mixed with the crisp autumn air. Yet, amidst the revelry, a group of strangers appeared, tall figures, draped in long, tattered cloaks, their faces hidden beneath snarling, lifelike werewolf masks. The masks were unnervingly detailed, the fur matted with what looked like dirt and dried blood, the eyes behind them glinting in the firelight. At first, people thought it was an elaborate prank. Someone laughed nervously, but as the group moved through the crowd without speaking, without acknowledging anyone, an uneasy silence fell. The strangers stood in a circle at the edge of the square, watching, their presence heavy and menacing. A woman named Clara, known for her curiosity and skepticism, approached one of them. "Nice masks," she said, trying to sound casual, though her heart raced. The figure did not respond, only tilted its head slightly, as if listening to something far off. She reached out, intent on pulling at the mask's edge to reveal the person beneath, but as her fingers brushed the fur, she recoiled. It was warm, too warm, and it pulsed beneath her touch, as if alive. Her eyes widened, and she stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. The figure let out a low growl, so deep it vibrated in her chest. The other masked figures turned in unison, their eyes now glowing with a dull, amber light. Clara stumbled, fear freezing her in place, and just as quickly as they had appeared, the group melted into the shadows of the alleyways, vanishing as if they were never there. Whispers spread quickly through the crowd. Some dismissed the group as overzealous costume enthusiasts, but others, like Clara, couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was at play. She confided in a few close friends, and together, they decided to investigate. That night, armed with flashlights and nerves of steel, they ventured into the woods, following the faint trail of the strangers. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. The usual sounds of the forest were absent: no rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just an eerie, deafening silence. Suddenly, the group stopped. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was an old, forgotten house. Its windows were dark, and its roof sagged as if it had been abandoned for years. But the front door stood ajar, a faint glow emanating from inside. With a deep breath, Clara led the way, her hand trembling on the flashlight. As they approached, the glow intensified, revealing symbols carved into the doorframe, ancient runes none of them recognized. Inside, they found what looked like an old ritual chamber, its walls covered in faded paintings of wolves and moons. At the center of the room lay a large, circular stone altar, stained dark with something long dried. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come." The group spun around, their flashlights flickering wildly. Standing in the doorway were the masked figures, though now, their masks seemed to twist and contort as if they were not masks at all, but faces of creatures caught between man and beast. Clara's heart raced. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. The tallest of the figures stepped forward, its eyes glowing brighter. "We are the Forgotten, the Cursed, and now you've seen too much." Before anyone could react, the figures lunged, their movements too fast, too precise to be human. Screams echoed through the forest as the group scattered, desperately running back toward the town. Clara ran faster than she ever had, the sounds of growls and snapping twigs close behind her. When she finally burst into the town square, breathless and covered in dirt, the festival was still in full swing. Laughter filled the air, and people danced around the bonfires, oblivious to the horrors lurking just beyond the trees. She looked back, expecting to see the figures emerging from the woods, but there was nothing. No movement, no glowing eyes. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Clara tried to warn the others, but her words fell on deaf ears. The festival carried on, and the town returned to its peaceful routine. But Clara knew better. Every night, she would hear the howls growing louder, closer, and sometimes, when she walked alone, she felt eyes on her watching, waiting. The strangers in the werewolf masks had left, but they weren't gone. They were hiding in plain sight, waiting for the next phase of their twisted game. The question that haunted Clara now was simple. Who among the townsfolk was still human and who had already become something else? Clara couldn't sleep. Every night since that encounter, the howls outside her window grew louder, more insistent. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they dismissed it as coyotes or wolves from the nearby woods. But Clara knew better. Something unnatural was stirring, creeping into the edges of Briarwood, and she could feel its presence tightening around the town like a noose. She avoided going out after dark, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched had become constant, even in broad daylight. Every time she stepped outside, there were faces that lingered too long, eyes that followed her every movement. People she'd known all her life, the butcher, the librarian, even her closest friends now seemed distant, cold, as if a shadow had settled over them. One evening, while walking home from the general store, she saw them again. The strangers in the werewolf masks, standing in the alleyway between two buildings. Their glowing eyes fixed on her as she froze in place. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air around them crackled with a strange energy. She blinked, and they were gone. Heart-pounding, she hurried home, locking every door and window. But as she sat at the kitchen table, trying to calm her nerves, she noticed something strange. On the back of her hand was a symbol of faint, almost invisible mark that hadn't been there before. It looked like one of the runes from the old house in the woods. She rubbed at it, but it wouldn't fade. A knock at the door startled her. It was too late for visitors. Slowly, cautiously, she opened it a crack. Clara. It was Beth, her childhood friend, standing on the porch with an uneasy expression. "Can I come in?" Clara hesitated. Something about Beth seemed off. Her usually warm smile was gone, replaced by a blank, almost forced expression. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, stepping aside to let her in. Beth glanced around nervously before speaking. "I've been having dreams. Dreams about the woods. And the masks." Clara's blood ran cold. "The masks?" Beth nodded. "I see them every night. They're standing in a circle, chanting something I can't understand. And then, one of them takes off their mask, but there's nothing underneath. Just darkness." Clara sat down, her heart racing. "It's not just dreams. I saw them. In the woods. In town. They're real, Beth. And something's happening, something bad." Beth's hands trembled as she placed a piece of paper on the table. It was a sketch, hastily drawn, of the same runes that Clara had seen on her hand and in the house. "I found these in my house," Beth whispered, "carved into the walls. I don't know what they mean, but I think they're marking us." Clara's mind raced. The runes, the masks, the feeling of being watched. She realized now that the town wasn't just being haunted by these masked figures they were hunting, choosing their prey one by one. And somehow, she and Beth were at the center of it. A sharp howl echoed through the night, closer than ever. Beth's eyes widened in fear. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But as Clara stood to grab her coat, she caught sight of movement outside the window. Dark shapes, slinking through the shadows, circling her house. The glowing eyes of the masked figures were unmistakable. "They've already found us," Clara muttered. "There's no way out." Beth backed away from the window, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "What did they want from us?" "I don't know," Clara said, her voice shaking. "But we're not the first. I think they've been here longer than any of us realize. Maybe years, maybe centuries." Just then, a loud banging erupted from the front door, rattling the entire house. Beth screamed, and Clara's blood turned to ice. The door splintered under the force of the blows, and as it gave way, the tall, cloaked figures in the werewolf masks stepped inside, their glowing eyes scanning the room. Clara grabbed Beth's hand and ran toward the back door, but one of the figures moved impossibly fast, blocking their path. Up close, Clara could see that the mask wasn't a mask at all. The fur was part of its face, its snout twitching, nostrils flaring as it inhaled her scent. She could hear the low growl rumbling deep in its chest. "Why us?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she held Beth's hand tightly. The creature leaned closer, its eyes gleaming with something that felt like recognition. Its voice, when it spoke, was low and guttural, barely more than a whisper. "You were chosen." "Chosen for what?" Beth cried, her voice filled with panic, but the creature did not answer. Instead, it raised a clawed hand, tracing one of the runes in the air between them. The mark on Clara's hand began to burn, searing into her skin like a brand. She screamed in pain, but there was nothing she could do. Suddenly, the creatures began to back away, their eyes still locked on Clara and Beth, but there was no immediate violence. The tallest of the masked figures stepped forward again, its voice soft but filled with menace. "The time will come. You cannot run from what you are now." Without another word, they melted into the night, leaving Clara and Beth gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from the encounter. Clara looked down at the rune on her hand. It was glowing faintly now, pulsing with an otherworldly light. She realized then that they were no longer mere prey. They had been marked, claimed by something ancient and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "What are we supposed to do?" Beth whispered, tears streaming down her face. Clara shook her head, fear gripping her heart. "I don't know, but we need to find out what these marks mean, and who they want us to become." The howls in the distance grew louder, more persistent, as the two women stared into the dark forest, knowing that whatever had begun, it was far from over. Clara and Beth didn't waste time after that night. They searched for answers in every corner of Briarwood, scouring the town's archives and speaking to anyone who might know something: old hermits, reclusive historians, even the town's priest. But no one had ever heard of the strange runes or the masked figures, and most dismissed their story as hysteria brought on by stress. Still, the marks on their hands continued to burn, glowing faintly in the dark, a constant reminder that their time was running out. One evening, nearly a week after their encounter, Clara received an anonymous letter slid under her door. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the handwriting jagged and desperate. It simply read, "Asterisk asterisk, the wolves are not what they seem. Find the well beneath the forest. Time is short. Asterisk asterisk, the well beneath the forest." Clara had no idea what it meant, but something in her gut told her this was their last chance. She showed the note to Beth, and together, they ventured back into the woods, where the masked figures had first appeared. Armed with nothing but flashlights and sheer desperation, they pressed deeper into the forest than they had ever gone before. The trees grew thicker, the air heavier, until they stumbled upon an ancient, crumbling stone well hidden beneath a tangle of ivy and dead leaves. Its mouth gaped open, a yawning void that seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. "This has to be it," Beth whispered, her voice trembling. Clara nodded, though fear gnawed at her insides. There was something about the well, something wrong. The darkness within it felt alive, pulsing in sync with the runes on their hands. "Do we go down?" Beth asked, her voice barely audible. Before Clara could answer, a deep, guttural howl echoed through the woods, closer than ever before. The masked figures had returned. Clara's heart leapt into her throat as she and Beth spun around, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The figures stood at the edge of the clearing, watching silently. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, but this time, their bodies were shifting beneath the cloaks. The fur on their faces rippled, their bones cracking audibly as their forms twisted into something even more monstrous. Clara's breath quickened as she realized the truth: these weren't just men in masks. The masks were asterisk their faces, and they were slowly becoming something else, something more feral. "We have to go," Clara screamed, grabbing Beth's arm and pulling her toward the well. Without thinking, they clambered over the stone rim and began to descend into the darkness below. The smell of damp earth and rock filled their noses as they climbed down the slick stones, their hands trembling with every movement. Above them, the masked figures had gathered at the well's edge, peering down with glowing eyes. Clara's heart raced as their low growls echoed off the walls, following them deeper into the void. Finally, they reached the bottom. The air was thick and cold, and as their feet touched the ground, they realized they were standing in ankle-deep water. The space around them was small, claustrophobic, but just ahead, something glimmered faintly in the darkness, a stone slab, covered in the same runes that marked their hands. Beth shined her flashlight on it, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" Clara knelt before the slab, running her fingers over the carvings. They were old, impossibly old, but as her hand brushed the center, something clicked. The rune on her hand flared with a searing light, and the slab began to tremble. The ground shook violently, and the walls of the well seemed to groan, as if something immense was stirring beneath them. Clara stepped back in horror as the stone slab slid away, revealing a gaping pit beneath it, deeper than the well itself. From the depths of the pit came a sound, a low, guttural growl, unlike anything they had heard before. "What is that?" Beth gasped, backing away. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. She could feel something rising from the darkness below, something ancient, something that had been trapped for far too long. "We have to leave," she whispered. "We made a mistake." But as they turned to climb back up, they froze. The masked figures were now standing at the bottom of the well, blocking their exit. Their bodies had fully transformed, half man, half beast, their jaws dripping with saliva, their eyes blazing with the fire of the hunt. One by one, they advanced, their claws scraping against the stone. Clara and Beth were trapped. There was no way out. Desperation clawed at Clara's mind as she backed toward the pit. The growling from the depths grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever lay beneath was awakening, called by the runes on their hands. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The runes they had triggered something that the masked figures had been guarding. The leader of the figures, now fully transformed into a grotesque, werewolf-like creature, let out a guttural snarl, stepping closer until its face was inches from Clara's. Its hot breath washed over her, and for a moment, it seemed to pause, as if waiting for something. Then, from the pit, a voice, not a growl, but a voice whispered, ancient and cold, asterisk, asterisk, the pact is sealed. Asterisk, asterisk, the creatures stopped in their tracks, their eyes now fixed on the pit. A slow, terrible smile spread across the leader's face as it turned its gaze back to Clara. She realized, with dawning horror, that the mark on her hand wasn't a curse. It was an invitation. The pit rumbled, and a clawed hand, massive, skeletal, and dripping with darkness, emerged from the depths, reaching for her. Clara screamed, but there was nowhere to run. The hand grasped her arm with a strength that stole the air from her lungs, pulling her toward the pit. Beth screamed, grabbing at Clara's free hand, but the pull was too strong. Clara's eyes locked with Beth's, wide with terror. "Don't let go," Clara begged, but the force was relentless. As Clara was dragged into the abyss, Beth could only watch in horror. The masked figures knelt in reverence, their glowing eyes flickering in the dark as the pit devoured Clara whole. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her was the voice again, whispering in her ear. Asterisk, asterisk, welcome home. Asterisk, asterisk, Beth stumbled back, alone in the cold, empty well. The masked figures had vanished, and the pit had sealed itself, leaving no trace of what had just occurred. But the rune on her hand still burned, brighter now. She was next,